All right, well, thank you for the invitation to present on this topic. The title of my talk is Pretty Invasives Can Be Pretty Invasive. And I want to encourage all of you not to be beguiled by beautiful non-native plants. And we're going to talk about some of those today. There's some notable species that really do present a lot of problems to our environment and our natural ecosystems, and that's really what I'm here to talk about tonight. As mentioned, I am the chief scientist at Mad Scientist Associates. We do ecological and wetland consulting. We deal with this issue all the time on our project sites. My wife and I own this business, as well as we're part owners in Scioto Gardens Native Plant Nursery, which also has a vested interest in educating the public about their landscaping choices and the use of in the landscape as opposed to, so just wanted to mention that. So I think a lot of us, particularly when we haven't been introduced to the idea of what an introduced or invasive species is, can be enamored of certain species that are have been or are currently offered as horticultural landscape plantings. And I want to talk to you a little bit about these species that look really good on the surface when you don't understand the implications to the environment from their introduction. So they are pretty, no doubt about that. I wouldn't argue that these plants are not beautiful in appearance, but these species that we're going to talk tonight should not elicit oohs and ahs, but rather oohs and args, because they really are kind of disastrous for our environment. The image on the left is a floodplain that is just loaded up with a very attractive plant called Lesser celandine, and it has established within that floodplain area to the exclusion of all other native species. Very, very aggressive. The image on the right is a very depauperate understory community over a stream that is completely covered over by honeysuckle, Amer honeysuckle, which is another one of our very problematic species. So while these plants may look attractive when they're kind of isolated in a landscape bed and tended to, once they escape cultivation and end up in our natural environments, they can really wreak havoc with our ecosystems. So I want to start off with some terminology. First, that of aggressive species, and I want to distinguish aggressive from invasive because I'm going to use that in a very specific context. So a species that spreads rapidly, often at the expense of biological diversity, other species within the system, sometimes forming monocultures, could be termed aggressive. These species are often very opportunistic. They respond to disturbances that could be fire, flooding, other ground disturbance, but anything that disturbs the existing plant community or soils can result in an overrun or aggressive species that can get established, and they can be very difficult to control. In general terminology, folks might refer to aggressive species as invasive species. But we do have native species that have a tendency to spread readily in an aggressive fashion. And there are those that would argue that we don't consider those invasive because they are native to our environment and they just happen to have kind of an aggressive growth habit. So aggressive species can be native or introduced. What is an introduced species? These are non-native or alien plants, generally deliberately or accidentally introduced by humans. And there are some introduced plants that aren't particularly invasive, but they're still considered to be introduced. But the ones that happen to be aggressive are those that we're most concerned about. Another term you may encounter are exotic plants. I'm using some NRCS definitions on this particular slide. You can find a website where NRCS puts these definitions together. But exotics are plants that are not native to the continent on which they are found. So as an example, plants from Europe are exotic in North America. Plants from North America are exotic in Japan. And in some contexts, exotic will be used to describe species that originate in regions with different climates, generally different latitudes, to where they are unable to survive the climate in which they're introduced. So we might think about trying to grow a banana plant in boreal Canada. Those plants aren't going to overwinter successfully and survive, and they are exotic. But sometimes you'll see exotic as a term used to describe any plant that's non-native or alien. So the species we're going to cover tonight are both introduced and aggressive, and that's how I tend to view the term invasive, or how I use it. And I have two slides here that cover the species that I'd like to talk about tonight. The list of invasive species is longer, but I've targeted those that are of particular concern because of their invasive nature, and those that tend to be more easily found in our local landscapes, where people might actually be purchasing these plants or adding them to their landscapes, maybe trading with neighbors, etc. So this first slide covers herbaceous plants and vines and ground covers. So these are plants like the lesser celandine that I had in the one of the previous slides. Purple loosestrife, which is a big invader in wetland habitats. Garlic mustard, which shows up about anywhere, but particularly in forested understory areas. And then Dame's rocket, which that's one that I was a little sad to learn was actually a introduced species. It's not quite as invasive as some of the others we'll discuss, but it is very attractive, and people tend to see it along roadsides and think, I'd like some of that in my yard, and transplant it, and it can get away from you. Then we have some vine species which could serve as ground cover, or vines that would vine up over things. So I footnoted that ground cover qualifier as actually a everything cover, because these three species in particular will grow up, climb just about anything and end up covering over trees, shrubs, fences, buildings, etc. And these include the Oriental Bittersweet, which we have a native equivalent of that, winter creeper, and English ivy. Recently in our state, the Department of Agriculture has made certain species illegal to sell in Ohio. So commercial enterprises are now banned from selling these plants. And the state gave the nurseries a little bit of time to kind of rid themselves of their current stock. I think just as a means of not forcing economic losses on the nurseries. So these things are now illegal. I believe we're still in a grace period where nurseries are allowed to sell some of their remaining plants, but there's a date on the horizon, which I'm not sure exactly what that date is, that they will no longer be allowed to legally sell any of these plants. So I've noted those species with a red X. And then shrubs and trees tend to be one of the biggest problem areas in terms of invasives in our natural ecosystems. Those kind of mid-story, understory species that can claim a lot of ground within our deciduous forests. These include things like the burning bush, privet, Japanese barberry, and also common barberry, which interestingly to me, the list of banned species did not include Japanese barberry, but it did include common barberry. I need to look into that a little bit to see if maybe they're kind of lumping those two together, but they actually listed a different species as being banned for nursery trade. Amur honeysuckle, which is the major player in terms of the bush honeysuckles that kind of clog up our forests and compromise our spring wildflower displays within forested areas. Autumn olive, which is autumn olive and multiflora rose, both of which were kind of brought in as conservation plantings for soil stabilization, interestingly enough. Louis Bromfeld was one of the, he's an author who was the owner of Malabar Farms, if you've ever toured that historic site in Ohio. And he was an author and big proponent of planting multiflora rose as a natural hedge, which was being promoted by the federal government at the time to act as a living fence for cattle and also as a way to stabilize the soil. But it's really run rampant within our natural ecosystems. And then finally, the Calorie pear, which has really come onto our radar recently now that a lot of the Calorie pears that have been planted over the past decade have matured and started to spread with help from the birds that eat their small pear fruits and drop them out across the landscape. And we've got a lot of pear around our community, including things that were planted by the city and are now being systematically removed. That last one, the Calorie pear, has proven to be a really poor choice for a street tree planting because they tend to have very weak stems, and when they get large, they're prone to just split and have a major branch drop off. And if you're on a street where you have street parking, a lot of cars have been damaged by these trees just falling apart in storms. So how did they get here? How did these invasive species get here? Humans are largely responsible through international travel and tourism, different forms of trade. Wood pallets and things like that can harbor invasive species. That's how the emerald ash borer arrived, was in wooden pallets. But seeds can adhere to about anything. Seeds can be brought in bilge water from ships that are coming into Lake Erie with shipping vessels. And when they release their bilge water, they can release non-native seeds into our aquatic ecosystems, affecting our wetlands and lakes. It's all about trade and then moving things around through recreational activities and commercial activities, running ATVs and bikes and things through certain types of environments can actually pick up a lot of seeds and move them around the state. You know, if the equipment is not cleaned well after use, then a lot of those seeds, you know, move with the vehicle to the next site that they decide to run their ATV on. So things get spread around that way. And then in terms of natural vectors, we have things like wind, water, animals that can spread these seeds around. The horticulture industry is certainly a major player. A lot of the plants that were brought over from Europe and other places because we thought they looked pretty and they were fairly reliable in terms of you know, their flowers and color and structure. They were heavily promoted by the horticultural industry and offered for sale. And so we've spread things around as we've kind of latched onto these different species and incorporated them into our landscape. So I would just mention here that as gardeners, that we want to be really wary of trading plants, sharing plants with others if we don't understand their, you know, whether they're native or invasive. So know what you're dealing with, know whether it's a plant that really should be shared around or if it's one that you should actively be trying to control within your landscape. So why are we concerned about these species? There's a lot of research on the influence of non-native species on our natural ecosystems. They can be very damaging for water quality. There's a professor at University of Dayton who did a bunch of research recently on the effects of honeysuckle on stream biota, the insects that live within streams. And he actually found that streams that are loaded up with leaf litter from honeysuckle have depressed aquatic communities. Fewer species can actually live there due to some chemical and physical changes to the ecosystem as a result of leaf deposition from the honeysuckle. These plants are known to spread rapidly to the detriment of other species, which is an automatic reduction in biological diversity and habitat quality. Certain species can increase the fire risk just by providing a lot of fuel within the understory that is more easily ignited during fires. The growth of heavy cover can affect other forms of succession. Natural reforestation of areas is compromised if they're completely blanketed by invasive species. It just makes it harder for tree seeds to find a good place to germinate. It can actually lower the light penetration to the forest floor and just kind of stymie the whole process of natural succession. And they can be pretty expensive to control. I found a little summary from this Rideau Thousand Islands Master Gardeners site that provided some definitions of levels of invasiveness. I'm not going to read these descriptions, but most of the species that we're discussing tonight, I would say, are in the moderately to highly invasive range of invasiveness. And we probably have a few here that could be considered transformers that exclude all other species and dominate sites indefinitely. And I would include the first plant on my hit list here, the lesser celandine, in that group, as well as Amur honeysuckle. Those both tend to be extremely aggressive and have a tendency to form monocultures to where there's just nothing else left. So I'm going to go through each of these species in turn, just share a few factoids along the way. I was a bit strapped for time, so I haven't added all my talking points in slides. So I'm just giving you a graphic and then kind of narrating it, and hopefully you'll be okay with that. So this is lesser celandine. It's a low growing plant, only stands 6 to 8 inches tall. and it looks extremely strikingly beautiful. It's easy to imagine some really pretty low angle photographs across the forest floor, just blanketed with yellow flowers, looking very appealing to the average consumer. And yet this is a really tenacious, hard to manage invasive species that we've seen on sites, just completely blanketing floodplain areas. It produces these little bulblets on the stem, which can wash with floodwaters or tumble down slopes within forested areas, and then create new plants. The bulblets will generate another plant. So it spreads like crazy. Any place where there's a little bit of a grade for the bulblets to tumble down slope or to get washed around with the action of floodwaters. And then it just completely dominates the ecosystem. So this one is a real problem, and it will show up in flower beds. It can show up in unusual places. I actually have a high school friend that I need to make a call to because he's got a little patch in his front bed, and I don't know if he planted it there or it just showed up, but I'm going to encourage him to pull that little cluster out and replace it with something else. So that's the lesser celandine. Next up is purple loosestrife. This is a really pretty plant. It's generally considered a wetland plant, but it will, if grown in a flower bed, it will do just fine. And there are purple loosestrife plants that are commercially available, and we've been told for years that they were a sterile hybrid cross that couldn't produce viable seed. But this idea has been largely debunked, and we found that even the commercially available purple loosestrife can cross-pollinate with our other introduced purple loosestrife and escape from cultivation. So it's another one that we really don't like to see used in any type of a landscaping setting. And a big part of my work is in wetlands, so I've seen this reach problematic levels within wetland environments in particular. Garlic mustard, probably not the most beguiling or beautiful plant, but it's not a bad looker, and it has some culinary value. You can eat the greens, kind of like spinach. Has a nice garlicky flavor. So for control of this plant, we do encourage people to eat it if they're so inclined. But garlic mustard is a biennial. It seeds prolifically, and in the first year, it'll grow a basal rosette of leaves that you'll see on the ground. And then in the second year, it bolts and will grow these kind of pretty white flowers, and then just spread throughout an area. And it tends to be a real problem in a lot of our forests where it just kind of takes over in the understory. Good news about this one is it's fairly easy to pull, unlike a lot of our invasive species. It's just time consuming to go through and pull those plants up, and you want to get them before they go to seed so that you're not spreading seeds around. The next one is Dame's Rocket. This is the one that I mentioned was sort of a disappointment when I learned that it was not a native species. It's a plant that is probably familiar to many of us from just driving down the highway. You'll see these big banks of purple and white flowers, and it's actually all the same species, just different color variants of Dame's Rocket. And it is on the lower end of the invasivity scale, but once it gets into an area, it tends to stay and gradually spread. I've not seen it in situations where it got so out of control that it's the only thing you can find, but it still has a level of aggressiveness and is non-native. So those are the kind of herbaceous species on the on the list here tonight. Then we want to talk about Oriental Bittersweet. This is Salastris orbiculatus. It has a vining tendency, and it has these beautiful orangish berries that form in the fall. But it's just a creeping monstrosity, and when it gets established, it will climb over trees and completely cover them over. We've seen trees dead from the overgrowth of Oriental Bittersweet because it'll just completely blanket the tree so that the leaves can no longer photosynthesize, and eventually the tree dies. It's kind of being suffocated essentially, or starved by the bittersweet. Winter creeper, this one is a common ground cover that's used by people. Has very thick, glossy leaves and a vining tendency with lots of tendrils. So it really hugs on to whatever it's growing on. It can be very challenging to remove, but this is another plant that will grow up and over trees and fences and buildings, and can be difficult to eradicate. So it looks nice, but it's very deleterious to the surrounding plant community when it gets established. English ivy is another one of those ground covers that looks quite attractive and interesting, grown deliberately for its aesthetic, and particularly in academic settings. We have our Ivy League schools. They plant ivy and get ivy growing up on the buildings, but we'll find this escaped into natural environments, covering over large areas of forest floor. So we try to eradicate it when we can. And now here's some shrubs. This one is extremely popular. It is the burning bush, and it's so named because the leaves in the fall turn bright red. It's generally got a nice structure to it, interesting twigs. Even in the winter, the plant looks kind of interesting because the twigs have kind of corky wings on them, and it can be a very attractive landscape planting, but we're finding it increasingly in natural forested settings, and it has become a nuisance invasive that's causing some impacts to our environment. Privet is the kind of quintessential hedge, which is why I threw that extra photo in there. This is another one that is very much escaped from cultivation. We see this a lot when we're doing plant survey work in forested settings. Fortunately, in the understory, it doesn't tend to flourish as well as the Amer honeysuckle. So it's pretty rare that we find large patches of privet, but it's often within the system. So you'll find smaller privet. It just doesn't like forest understory, the shade that's provided as much. So it'll be kind of widely dispersed unless you have a forested clearing where it's getting some more sun, and then it can grow more prolifically. And it only looks like a hedge if it's being managed by humans to shape it in that way. But in the forest, it's a little bit more of a spindly, sprawling plant. Another very popular plant is the Japanese barberry. These are attractively colored. The foliage will turn red in the fall. They have these little tic-tac size fruits that form that also look very interesting. It's a thorny plant. It has little spines at the nodes where the leaves come out, and can be a real hassle if you're having to navigate through a patch of this stuff because it is loaded with little spines. that can stick you as you're trying to navigate through. But this one, if you start looking around in residential plantings, even in commercial landscapes around office buildings and things, there's inevitably a Japanese barberry in there somewhere. It's definitely a heavily utilized plant in landscape settings. And this is our Amer honeysuckle. It has opposite leaves. The leaves have these long attenuate tips to them. It's kind of a long tapered leaf. Lots and lots of blossoms that have a sweet smell to them. They form red berries that are paired in the leaf axils. So they look really interesting in the fall as well when they've gone to fruit. But this honeysuckle, as well as a couple other honeysuckle species that are in the bush honeysuckle group, present a lot of issues in our forests. And this plant in particular, part of the harm that it inflicts is the result of the fact that it leafs out before anything else in our deciduous forests, so that when you're driving in probably late March, early April, looking at forests where the trees are still bare, but there's just a mass of green underneath those trees. Generally, that mass of green is because it leaves out so early, it's on a much different cycle than our native deciduous trees. And the plants that have co-evolved with our deciduous trees that provide a lot of beauty and ecological value in our forests, things that we refer to as spring ephemerals or spring wildflowers, they get completely shaded out. There's no opportunity for them to get any sun or warmth. They're in the deep shade of the Amer honeysuckle before they would normally even germinate. And so at some point they're just lost from the system. And that's how we end up with the conditions that were shown in the image that I had early in the slide set, where that stream was just completely covered with Amer honeysuckle and there was nothing underneath it. It's kind of staggering really to get under honeysuckle shrub and realize how little there is going on, that there's nothing even covering the ground. It's just bare earth because of the competition factor and also some allelotoxins that are released by this plant that really make the soil inhospitable to anything else. So that one's a major problem player. Introduced invasive is the autumn olive. This is another plant that is really fascinating. I'm a plant person and I really like autumn olive. It's unique. It's got this silvery cast to the leaves and flowers. Just a really interesting looking plant. And again, it was brought in as a conservation planting when we weren't so well informed about how it was going to behave in our natural ecosystems. And now particularly in field settings, more open field settings where there's been some form of disturbance, the autumn olive can just take over and you'll just have these big autumn olive shrubs everywhere. Again, very attractive plant. It might look like something that you would want in your landscape just because it's an interesting looking plant with those silvery leaves, but very detrimental to the ecosystem. And then the Multiflora rose. This plant produces lots and lots of flowers, hence Multiflora. That can be very appealing, but they are extremely aggressive, hard to control. The stems on the roses are just spindly enough that it's hard to be able to use any kind of mechanical removal because the stems will just break when you're trying to pull them up. So you almost have to dig them up or just rely on like a foliar spray of herbicide to try to kill them back. You can cut them down, but they're going to resprout from the cut material. This plant, I've seen it in some settings where it just goes on for hundreds of feet, where it's just a thicket of multiflora rose. Can be nearly impassable, impenetrable to a human, and probably to many animals as well. I had a staff person who I felt like I almost ruined her wedding day, because we were doing field work and had to pass through this giant field full of multiflora rose. And my wife and I were invited to attend her wedding, and the poor girl was in her wedding dress, sleeveless wedding dress, with scratches all over her from battling through the multiflora rose a couple days prior. It's a nasty, challenging plant, and one that when you try to fight it, it fights back. And then finally, I'll end with a tree species, and we do have a number of trees that are noteworthy in the fact that they're very aggressive and invasive, but there are a few that I think are beguiling to people, that they would want to have in their landscape necessarily. Tree of Heaven is an interesting tree, but it's not one that you might choose to plant in your landscape, but it's invasive. Calorie pear, however, has some redeeming qualities, and it's loaded with white blossoms. Very pretty tree, but it has definitely escaped into the environment. Birds are actively spreading this tree around, and it can form impenetrable thickets, and it can be very challenging to get through, because the branchlets actually have these spur-like, they're kind of thorn-like short branchlets that kind of function like a thorn, so it can really tear you up to try to get through this when it forms those big thickets. And like honeysuckle, the areas underneath a big pear thicket tend to be fairly devoid of any vegetation. So this one's a real challenge, and is on the list of now illegal for sale in Ohio plants. So you may be asking yourself, how can I help? Oh, let me stop here for a second. I see we did get a question. Marty asks, what steps should be taken to remove lesser celandine from a garden? It's hard to remove. I understand it's a problem if you leave one tiny bulb. So yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about control, not specific to each species, but for lesser celandine with small areas that have been affected, oftentimes just hand digging the plant is the best means of control. You just have to make sure you get all of the tuber underneath that plant, as well as the little bulblets that grow on the stem. But if you're careful to extract the whole plant and its root system, you can get on top of it by that means. Other than that, herbicide application is probably the way to go. And it depends on the size of the area. Some areas are small enough that I would definitely recommend digging, but once you have, maybe several hundred square feet, it may be hard to just hand dig that. So you'll probably want to opt for chemical control. So we have another question. Is the calorie pear that we see driving on highways, that which is spreading through the wooded areas, and what is the difference with the Bradford pear? Bradford, I believe, is just another common name for calorie. I think Bradford pears are also Pyrus caloriana, and you really do well to dig into the actual species identification, because some trees are marketed based on commercial names or other common names, which are borderline meaningless. So yes, the trees that we see along the highways for the most part are Calorie pear, and they're spreading all over the place now. We've got a lot of them in the city. We just did made a big effort at Highlands Park to remove a whole hill slope that was nothing but the Calorie pear, so that we could plant native deciduous trees near the wetland there at Highlands. And yet we still have a few Calorie pear planted as kind of landscape trees around the park, but we removed them from the natural buffer of the wetland area. So another question, how soon does soil around honeysuckle regenerate so that you can plant natives? That's a good question. I think that there probably is a bit of a recovery period. You can probably help that along by adding organic matter and turning the soil just to improve the soil quality and reduce the pathogens that may be associated with the original plant. If I had to guess, I would say you might want to give it a year before you invest a lot of time and energy. So remove the honeysuckle, improve the soil, and then allow things to kind of rest for a year, maybe just putting down an inexpensive cover crop, some type of an annual grass or something that you could later replace with natives, and that'll help to further improve the soil. So if you're interested in helping to improve the health of our environment, you can certainly avoid buying, planting, or sharing invasive species. You can work at controlling invasives in your yard. We regularly get involved with community invasive species control efforts, and those are oftentimes publicized through our company as well as local watershed groups. The city of Westerville has been behind some of these projects, so you can watch for opportunities like that. You definitely want to talk to your neighbors if they also have invasive species on their property, so that they can get their situation under control. Because if you work diligently on your own problem area and the neighbors around you aren't touching their honeysuckle or garlic mustard or lesser celandine, it's only a matter of time before it finds its way right back into your yard. So you really need a level of unification among the neighbors to really do it right, to tackle the problem in a more cohesive and comprehensive way. We like to promote the use of native species. If you can incorporate native species in your own landscape, that's of great benefit, particularly to our pollinators and other wildlife. Those species are best suited to our local environment, and it's the climate conditions that they're, climate and soil conditions that they're exposed to. So native species are really the way to go. Can really be beneficial. And the more we share this information around, the more we're all talking, I think the more people will come to understand the value in implementing some of these practices to improve our plant community and eradicate invasives. Somebody asked if I give talks to HOA groups. I do periodically. One of the more recent ones was specific to a wetland related issue, but I do come in to talk to HOAs about invasive species and native plants and things like that. I think education is the key, and telling your neighbors why you're doing what you're doing. That's beneficial. So I wanted to talk a little bit about invasive species control. we really, in the environmental field, we prefer opportunities to control invasives through physical and mechanical means. It's just more environmentally friendly, obviously, than having to use herbicides. But herbicides are one of those tools in the toolbox that may come into play, and oftentimes is necessary, just depending on the scale of the problem, the scale and severity. But with physical control, we're really talking about weeding. If you catch some of these invasives early, if you learn to recognize them, you can literally nip the problem in the bud, and keep your yard and landscape free of these invasives. If you're familiar with the term solarization, that's another way to kind of kill off plants within a problem area by laying out black plastic, just putting some cement blocks or bricks on it to hold the plastic in place. Just let things get really hot underneath, and over a period of weeks, you can actually kind of reset the system, kill off anything that's there under the tarp, and come back in and improve the soil and plant after that. With mechanical removal, we're talking about things like cutting or digging, which is still really a physical means of control. And if you've got the proper equipment and training, you can use burning to control some of these invasives. I have a flame weeder at my house that I like to use that can, it's just a propane tank with a little kind of torch head on it. And I've used that effectively with some invasives just to knock them back when I see them coming up. And it is, chemical free. Certainly comes with a carbon footprint, but it's a non-chemical means of trying to eradicate invasives. And then when you don't have those options, chemical treatments may become necessary. Foliar application, actually spraying herbicide on the leaves, is one way to go. It requires a bit more chemical and has maybe greater risks with the application with overspray. So that's one that we also try to use sparingly. It can be quite effective, but when you're using a sprayer, droplets are going everywhere. Most of it will get on a leaf, and even though our current generation of herbicides are relatively safe and will bind to the soil quickly, when it misses its target, it'll bind and immobilize and break down in a fairly short time period. There's still the potential for getting that herbicide on plants that you may want to protect and preserve. So it's probably one of the less preferred applications. We prefer to go with more spot treatment types of applications, including what's called a cut stump treatment, where you'll cut the shrub down to the ground to where it's just some little stumps, and apply, oftentimes with a brush or a sponge, herbicide right to that cut stump. And that's a very effective way at killing the root system without using a lot of herbicide. And there's very low incidence of any kind of collateral damage to your plants. This hack and squirt technique is one where it's kind of similar to the cut stump, except instead of having to cut the plant all the way to the ground, you take a hatchet and cut some little notches on the side of the plant, and then just pour a little bit of herbicide into that that little slit that you created in the side of the stem. So I would encourage you to research the best treatments for the plants that you're dealing with, and make sure you're using the right tool for the job if you go with herbicides. I'm always willing to answer questions in terms of the right herbicide to use. I'd probably actually turn that over to our team. We've got other certified applicators with the State Department of Agriculture that know the herbicide options better than I do even, but we're happy to help you out if you need some recommendations. So I want to jump back to a few questions here. Are the nurseries required to mark something as native? I don't know of any such requirements. It's always a good practice to ask if you're interested in native species about what what the actual species is, and know that there are pure strain native species that can be available, and hopefully the nursery operators are honest about what's a native strain. You can also get native Rs, that's just a combination of the word native and cultivar. So it's a kind of modified native species, which is probably preferable to a non-native species, but maybe less preferable than a true native. So something to watch out for. And honestly, I've got a mixture of pure natives and some native Rs in my yard, just because some of the native Rs have some really interesting properties. But increasingly, I'm trying to transition my landscape to almost all native species. But I don't know of any legal requirement for that type of labeling. You just have to ask the right questions. Have a question about how badly does solarization affect the microorganisms in the soil. This person Sarah has seen it discouraged for this reason. I don't know for a fact how damaging it is to microorganisms. If it's a fairly isolated area and you're just managing, 100 square feet or something with a black tarp, the microorganisms are going to recolonize that area pretty quickly when the solarization has been completed. If it were a much larger area, I could see that being problematic because it could affect such a wide area that it would take a while for that to recover, because there's no source areas for the microorganisms to reestablish from in the near term. But for small applications, I think solarization can be a workable scenario, which at least doesn't require herbicide. Hopefully that answers your question. And the last thing I want to say is that there's some really good resources out there when you're thinking about eradicating invasives, non-native species from your landscape. You kind of need to know what's next. What do I do to revegetate this area? And I wanted to turn you on to a book that has a lot of information. This is called Native Alternatives to Invasive Plants. If you want to spend a little bit of money, that's available on Amazon. It looks like a pretty useful resource. I don't own it yet, but I may purchase it. And then the Ohio Invasive Plant Council has a website, and they actually have a brochure that has a list of alternative plants for invasive native native alternatives for invasive plants in Ohio. And that's kind of a useful reference. I believe the Department of Natural Resources has also published a more extensive list of invasive species and their kind of native counterparts or alternatives that would kind of have a similar aesthetic and function to the invasive species. So Marty asks, what's the native alternative to burning bush? There's a variety of species. Probably the closest thing is actually one of our native euonymus shrubs. So the burning bush is Euonymus elatus. We also have American wahoo. I think that's the one that has the common name Hearts Bursting Open with Love, because of these interesting seed pods that open up, kind of a pinkish hull that opens up to expose red berries on the inside. and that's Euonymus atropurpureus. So there's actually a native euonymus that could be used. We also see things like viburnums as serving as a good substitute for burning bush. There's a variety of native viburnums, and a plant called ninebark. I have one in my front bed, which happens to be a native-R, but the ninebark is a really nice shrub that has interesting texture and interestingly shaped leaves. So it's a good substitute for burning bush. If you're looking for something that has some red color in the fall, I don't know that there's anything quite as impressive as burning bush with those red leaves, but things like Ilex verticillata, the I want to say winterberry holly. Those are really nice shrubs. They produce beautiful red berries, so you'll get a little bit of red color, and the leaves can be kind of reddish in the fall, as I recall. So there's a lot of good alternatives out there that really provide more quality food resources for wildlife, berries that are more that have greater nutritional value for our birds than things like the honeysuckle berries, and can also beautify our landscapes and kind of restore our local environment. So that's my spiel. I think we're about at time, but I'm happy to answer any other questions if anybody has them.
Thank you very much, Mark. And everybody, if you would like to go ahead and unmute and ask questions, or feel free to put them in the chat and I will ask them. But you just got one. Well, you got a statement from Karen.
Yes. Yeah, I should have thought of that one, because I just planted a bunch of black chokeberry at my house. It's just kind of getting started, but it's in bloom right now and it looks spectacular. I planted like 3 or 4 of them along a fence, and really happy with the plant right now. Once it gets a bit more size to it, it'll be fun to see the fall colors. It was just planted last year.
So can I ask you, do you have a favorite? Like, do you have a favorite native Ohio flower or tree or bush?
That's a tough one. I have, I guess I have a fondness for Virginia bluebell. I've planted a number of spring ephemerals around my yard, and the Virginia bluebells are just a special treat in the spring when you see those coming up. And it's a plant that pretty much disappears by June, maybe late June. You won't even see any trace of it. But it'll come back the next spring and just be this explosion of color in the spring. So you learn to love these fleeting moments of appreciation for nature when the spring ephemerals bloom and share their beauty with you for a few weeks, even though they kind of disappear later. So that's definitely up there on my list in terms of things I have planted in my yard. But I do think that black chokeberry is really one that I've got a growing fondness for. It's the first that I've ever planted this species, but it's looking really good.
Thank you. All right, and folks, just a quick aside in the chat. So the next program at the library for the gardening and nature series is on June 2nd. It's from 2 to 3. It's pollinators, native plants, and ecosystem health. And that is open for registration now. So you can head on over and sign up for that. As a reminder, this program, as well as all the other ones that we've had on Zoom, are being recorded. So a lot of these things like native grasses, native pollinators, all of those, we have quite a few videos on there from experts like Mark. And Mark, I believe you have another video on there that you did for us last year. So,
yes, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and thank you. And there is Mark's email. As one of the reasons I've been putting all of these websites in the chat is after I have edited the video from today's presentation, everyone will get a link to the video, and also you'll get a transcript of the chat. So all the information that we've shared, or if you've forgotten to write something down, hopefully, I managed to get it in chat at some point. So thank you for that. Well, Mark, very good job. Everybody, last call for questions and comments. Either unmute yourself or, use the chat.
I just want to mention to the group, I don't usually look quite this red, but I spent 3.5 hours in OSU Stadium yesterday watching my son graduate, along with 12,000 of his best friends.
That is the best reason to be red.
So,
don't worry.
I'm looking at myself on the screen thinking, man, am I red?
That's all right. Well, so congratulations on your son.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, everybody.
Thanks for joining me tonight.
Yeah, thank you again. Very good job, everybody. Thank you for attending, and keep an eye out for that email. All right, Mark, and I'll send you a copy of the unedited recording so that you can use it. Will.
Okay, great.
All right. Thank you, and
you
everybody. You have a good night.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.